This is a great pleasure. I've had practice at doing this, actually, particularly with Leon, since we go way back together. He is currently the Morrison Professor of History at University of California at Berkeley, and we were colleagues there for many years together. His first book was North of Slavery, The Negro in the Free States, 1790 through 1860, published, I believe, back in 1961. And then a book that made an enormous splash, published in 1979, was a book that many of you probably know about, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, which won the Francis Parkman Prize with its emphasis on style, the American Book Award, and the Pulitzer Prize. Leon has also done films and slides. He's won several teaching awards. He's been president of the Organization of American Historians, and we've both just come back from their annual meeting, which this year was in Indianapolis. His versatility and talents are just enormous. He and I both taught. I taught the first half, he taught the second half of a new course that began in 1968 at Berkeley on the history of Afro-Americans and race relations. And for a number of years, I taught the first half of the U.S. History Survey. He taught the second half, and he is still doing so. And doing so very well indeed. We're here to celebrate and hear him talk about his new book, which is Trouble in Mind, Black Southerners in the Age of Jim Crow. I've talked with him enough over the years of its development that I have enormously high expectations of it. I'm going to clear out quickly, Leon, but I do want to end with a quotation from Flannery O'Connor, which I thought you particularly would appreciate. This is what O'Connor had to say. Everywhere I go, I'm asked if I think the university stifles writers. My opinion is that they don't stifle them enough. There's many a bestseller that could have been prevented by a good teacher. Leon Litwack.
Thank you very much, Win. It's a pleasure to be back in Oxford. This is the official publication date of the book, and I couldn't think of a better place to be. And indeed, when C-SPAN said they would either come here or come to Berkeley, or I'm doing a reading on April the 9th, I said without hesitation, Oxford. And it's a pleasure to be here and to share some of this work with you, and to try to keep my remarks or reading as brief as possible. And I thought I would start with the initial story in the book, because that story really does set the mood for this work. Even though it's a bit long, I would still like to share that one with you at the very outset. I'm going to go in a kind of progression as the book moves along, and so this is part one, Baptisms. The pine board shack in which Charlie Holcomb spent his childhood in the late 19th century rested on top of a red clay hill about a quarter of a mile from the main road in Sampson County, North Carolina. His father, a tenant tobacco farmer, rose each morning at 4 o'clock, laid the logs for a fire, and roused the children, while Charlie's mother prepared a breakfast consisting of a pot of grits and a slab of salt pork. It was important to be in the field at sunup during the growing season, as the soil was poor and the labor that much more demanding. They worked till sundown. Grandfather Holcomb did not work in the field. He had the miseries in his back and walked with a stick. but he performed other chores, slopping the hogs and feeding the chickens. Charlie Holcomb, considered too young and frail to work in the fields, helped his grandfather with the chores and often accompanied him to the nearby creek to catch a mess of catfish for supper. As they sat there waiting for the fish to bite, grandfather would do a heap of thinking. And sometimes he shared his thoughts with Charlie, his youngest grandson, often imparting practical lessons drawn from his own life on how a black boy might hope to survive in the South less than half a century after emancipation. Charlie remembered one lesson in particular. After catching a large catfish, grandfather Holcomb toyed with it for a time, admonishing his grandson to watch him. He carefully lifted the fish out of the creek, let it thrash about, then lowered the line and returned the fish to the water. It would swim again, but not for long. Grandfather suddenly pulled it out on the bank where it thrashed about until it died. "Son," his grandfather observed, "a catfish is a lot like a nigger. As long as he's in his mud hole, he's all right. But when he gets out, he's in for a passel of trouble. You remember that. You won't have no trouble with folks when you grows up." Neither Charlie's father nor his grandfather had owned the land they worked. But as a young man, Charlie Holcomb aspired to improve himself and be independent of whites, and he possessed an abundance of confidence about his ability to succeed. He vowed to break with a bleak past of arduous and mostly unrewarded labor. "I thought I could manage my business better and that I was going to be able to own a place of my own someday. I was a high-minded young nigger and was full of get up and get. There was nothing in the world that I didn't think I could do." After his parents died, Charlie moved to Johnson County, North Carolina, took a job in the public works, saved some money, and married. In 1909, he settled down on a farm, determined to make it his own. But like so many aspiring young blacks, the children and the grandchildren of slaves, he confronted formidable obstacles in his struggle to be independent. "There was always something come along and knocked the props from under my plans." That something might be the worms, rust, or blight consuming the tobacco plants, or more often than not, poor and declining prices and the rigid controls exerted by white men over black income. The only certainty was that by the time the landlord had taken his share and deducted the cost for the fertilizer and the money or credit advances he had made, there wasn't but just enough to carry on till the next crop. But Charlie persisted, and one year he seemed primed to break out of the cycle of indebtedness. After selling his tobacco and settling with the landlord, he had something for himself, or so he thought. That was when the man called him back and told him he had underestimated the amount Charlie owed him for warehouse charges. The tactic was all too familiar, and Charlie's inability to read the books made any legal protest impossible. "I knowed it wasn't right, and it made me so mad I just hit him in the face as hard as I could." The judge sentenced Charlie to a year's labor on the roads, a lenient sentence for an interracial altercation. His wife and children did what they could to make a crop, but it was not enough to meet expenses. The landlord agreed to carry them over, and it took Charlie 3 years to pay him back. By that time, I knowed it wasn't no use for me to try to ever make anything but just a living. Although Charlie Holcomb made his accommodation, he wanted something better for his oldest son, Willie. I was determined my oldest child was going to have a chance in this world, and I sent him all the way through high school. That was more education than any Holcomb had known. But after completing high school, Willie wanted to go to college, arguing that it would enable him to improve his economic prospects significantly. At considerable sacrifice, the Holcombs sent their child to the Agricultural and Technical College of North Carolina in Greensboro. Willie worked hard, made good grades, and in the summer returned to help his parents with the crop. He would take the tobacco to market, carefully scrutinize the accounts, and invariably return with money in his pocket. As Willie progressed in college, however, his horizon widened and he became more ambitious. Increasingly dissatisfied with the tobacco business, he told his father this was no future for a black man with an education. He did not want to return to the farm. "That hurt me," Charlie Holcomb confessed, "because I had counted on Willie helping me, but I wanted him to do what he thought was best." Willie Holcomb graduated near the top of his class. And that, remembered Charlie, was when the trouble started. Despite his education, Willie found few opportunities open to him. He returned home from college disillusioned with his life and bitter over his limited prospects. When he started sitting around and drinking and getting mean, Charlie tried to reason with him, but little he could say would alleviate the disappointment and frustration. That fall, Willie took a load of tobacco to the warehouse and returned home angry and sullen. The next day he insisted on taking another load to the warehouse. Near dinner time, he had not yet returned. A neighbor finally appeared to inform Charlie that there had been a fight at the warehouse involving Willie. When Charlie reached the scene, he spotted his son lying on the ground, a puddle of blood around his head, and a group of white men standing nearby. I knowed he was dead the minute I seen him. For a while, Charlie just stood there not knowing what to do. He looked at the crowd and could not find a friendly or sympathetic face. Right then I knowed there wasn't no use to ask for no help, and that I was just a poor nigger in trouble. Holding Willie in his arms, Charlie could see that his son's head had been bashed in. There was tears running down my cheeks and dropping on his face, and I just couldn't help it. He placed his son in the wagon, tied the mule behind it, began his journey down the road. Reaching home, he washed Willie's head and dressed him in his best suit. Charlie and Dilly Holcomb then buried their son at the foot of the big pine tree near the well and planted some grass in the grave. Charlie Holcomb was never the same again. The spirit he had once shown in his determination to succeed no longer animated him. For a long time after that, I couldn't seem to get going, and there was a big chunk on the bottom of my stomach that just wouldn't go away. I'd go out at night and sit under the pines by Willie's grave and listen to the wind swishing in the needles, and I'd do a lot of thinking. He knew his son had been killed because of an argument, no doubt over the settling price for the tobacco that Willie had delivered. But Charlie blamed himself for his son's death. He had failed to heed his grandfather's admonition. I got to thinking about what Grandpappy had said about the catfish, and I know that was the trouble with Willie. He had stepped out of his place when he got that education. If I'd kept him here on the farm, he'd be all right. Niggers has got to learn that they ain't like white folks and never will be, and no amount of education can make them be, and that when they gets out of their place, there's going to be trouble. No other Holcomb child would be sent to college. They all settled down with their families and accommodated to the New South in the same way their father and grandfather had accommodated. They went about the business of surviving. Resigned to his place, Charlie no longer worried that much about the price his tobacco might bring him. The children came by occasionally to help him with the crops. He now had ample time to engage in his own heap of thinking, and his final years were increasingly reflective. Sitting by the fireplace, his mind often wandered back to his childhood. And I remember how my grandpappy used to take me fishing with him. Seems like when a fellow thinks back, he only remembers the good parts. The story of Charlie Holcomb evokes the contradictions of black life and coming of age in the New South. The initial hopes and aspirations, the often heightened expectations, as well as the frustrations, the terrors, the tensions, the betrayals, and the necessary accommodations. What came to be impressed on several generations of black Southerners, the first born in freedom and coming to maturity in the 1890s and the early 20th century, was the material, political, and military superiority of white people. The extraordinary power white men and women wielded over black lives and prospects in virtually all phases of daily life. The only thing that you'd be thinking of, remembered R.D. Clark Holliard, was that they were the ones that had everything. And they maintained their dominance, she sensed, because all the time they were taking advantage. You could see that. Working. The story surfaced in the 1930s, but the realities it depicted mirrored the experiences of scores of black men and women, probably a sizable majority in the late 19th century South. A white man and a black man happened upon two boxes at a rural crossroads, where so much seems to happen in Southern black lore. Having spotted the boxes first, the black man ran ahead and opted for the larger box. Upon opening it, he found picks, shovels, and hoes. He then turned around to see how the white man had fared. Well, the white man, he got the little box, and when he opened it, there were pens and pencils and paper and a big account book where he keeps all the figures what the niggers owe him. And that's the way it's been ever since. The nigger just can't outfigure the white man, for he's sure to cut you down. The literature and rhetoric of uplift and self-help proliferated almost in direct proportion to its irrelevance to the working lives of most black Southerners. It was not as though blacks were averse to the virtues deemed essential to success, but acquisition of those virtues appeared to make little or no difference. The experience of most black men and women in the New South directly contradicted the assurances and mocked that fundamental assumption of the American dream that material success is a direct result of hard work. Without any urging from others, and usually because they had no choice, black Southerners applied themselves to the tasks at hand and practiced the virtues thought necessary for economic well-being. But faithful adherence to the work ethic brought most of them nothing. A lifetime of hard work, honesty, diligence, frugality, and punctuality might, in fact, leave them worse off than when they began. For most black men and women, despite Booker T. Washington's optimism, the bootstraps approach simply did not work. No matter how hard they labored, no matter how they conducted themselves, no matter how fervently they prayed, the chances for making it were less than encouraging. The basic rules and controls remained in place. Our Father who is in heaven, white man owe me 11 and pay me 7. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. And if I hadn't took that, I wouldn't have had none. When Ned Cobb recalled that all God's dangers ain't a white man, he had the boll weevil in mind. Actually, both antagonists, the boll weevil and the white man, displayed aggressive appetites and the capacity to destroy black aspirations and to cheat blacks out of the products of their labor. Don't you see them critters? Now they have done me wrong. Boll weevil's got my cotton and the merchant's got my corn. What shall I do? What shall I do? But the boll weevil was no match for the white man's rapaciousness. What the boll weevil can do to me, Cobb reflected, ain't half so bad to what a man might do. I can go to my field and shake a poison dust on my crop and the boll weevil will sail away. But how can I sling a man off my back? That question took on a real urgency in the 1890s and the early 20th century, when white Southerners, faced with the specter of a new Negro, moved on every front to make certain that their assumptions about black inferiority went unchallenged. Boll weevil in the cotton, catworm in the corn, devil in the white man, what's going on? White folks, scriptures. If not removed altogether, Negroes needed to be rigidly monitored and regulated. The very language employed to describe the growing Negro menace suggested that the problem be treated like any other epidemic or virus threatening the health and security of the community. To assess the results of emancipation was to raise the specter of blacks, and I quote, inoculated with the virus of equality. To talk about black political participation was to talk about, and I quote, the cancer on the body politic, which if not cured, will make of it a carcass. To consider the social danger posed by blacks was to contemplate the need to avoid and reduce contamination, to dilute the black poison in the body of the South, as Atlanta's chief health officer expressed it, to the point where it lost its toxicity. The white people of the South, a Memphis merchant explained to an English visitor in 1909, had little choice but to practice pest control. We whites have learned to protect ourselves against the Negro just as we do against the yellow fever and the malaria, the work of noxious insects. White folks, acts. On boarding the streetcar, the woman took the most convenient seat available. What do you mean, the conductor shouted at her. Niggers don't sit with white folks down here. You must have come from way up yonder. The woman replied that she was a visitor and had no knowledge of the new law. Well, no back talk now, the conductor loudly admonished her, playing very much to his audience. That's what I'm here for, to tell niggers their place when they don't know them. The whites in the car laughed over her discomfort. Not one of them thought that I was embarrassed, wounded, and outraged by the loud, brutal talk of the conductor and the sneering, contemptuous expressions on their own faces. Rather than move to the Jim Crow section, she left the car altogether, prompting one of the passengers to remark, "These niggers get more impudent every day. She doesn't want to sit where she belongs." After walking downtown, the woman attempted to use an elevator in a public building, only to be told to heed the sign posted at the entrance. "I guess you can't read," the elevator operator told her, "but niggers don't ride in this elevator. We're white folks here, we are. Go to the back, you'll find an elevator for freight and niggers." The whites who then occupied the elevator appeared to enjoy her dismay. The day's events in this Alabama city had left their mark on the woman. As a native Southerner, the daughter of a former slave, it had not been her first experience with the ways of white folks, only a different manifestation of the same phenomenon. I had been humiliated and insulted often, but I never get used to it. It's new each time, and stings and hurts more and more. Her children, she knew, would be better educated than her generation, and she expected the accumulation of insults and humiliations to add to their dislike of whites. I dread to see my children grow up. I know not their fate. It does not matter how good or wise my children may be, they are colored. When I have said that, all is said. Everything is forgiven in the South, but color. Hellhounds. What was strikingly new and different in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was the sadism and exhibitionism that characterized white violence. The ordinary modes of execution and punishment were deemed insufficient. They no longer satisfied the emotional appetite of the crowd. To kill the victim was not enough. The execution tended to be turned into a public ritual, a collective experience, and the victim needed to be subjected to extraordinary torture and mutilation. What had been in the past a usually rapid dispatch of the victim now became part of a voyeuristic spectacle prolonged as long as possible, once for 7 hours, for the benefit of the crowd. The story of a lynching, then, is more than the simple fact of a black man or woman hanged by the neck. It is a story of slow, methodical, sadistic, often highly inventive forms of torture and mutilation. If executed by fire, it is a red-hot poker applied to the eyes and genitals, and the stench of burning flesh as the body slowly roasts over the flames and the blood sizzles in the heat. If executed by hanging, it is a convulsive movement of the limbs. Whether by fire or rope, it is the dismemberment and distribution of severed bodily parts as favors and souvenirs to participants and the crowd. Teeth, ears, toes, fingers, nails, kneecaps, bits of charred skin and bones. Such human trophies might reappear as watch fobs or be displayed conspicuously for public viewing. The severed knuckles of Sam Hose would be prominently displayed in the window of a grocery store in Atlanta. After learning of the lynching of her husband, Mary Turner, in her 8th month of pregnancy, vowed to find those responsible, swear out warrants against them, and have them punished in the courts. For making such a threat, a mob of several hundred men and women determined to teach her a lesson. After tying her ankles together, they hung her from a tree, head downward. Dousing her clothes with gasoline, they burned them from her body. While she was still alive, someone used a knife ordinarily reserved for splitting hogs to cut open the woman's abdomen. The infant fell prematurely from her womb to the ground and cried briefly, whereupon a member of this Valdosta, Georgia mob crushed the baby's head beneath his heel. The Associated Press, in its notice of the affair, observed that Mary Turner had made, as it said, unwise remarks about the execution of her husband. And the Associated Press said, the people, in their indignant mood, took exception to her remarks as well as her attitude. Neither crazed fiends nor the dregs of white society, the bulk of the lynchers tended to be ordinary and respectable people. animated by a self-righteousness that justified their atrocities in the name of maintaining the social and racial order and the purity of the Anglo-Saxon race. The mobs who meted out summary justice were pronounced by one Georgian as composed of our best citizens, who are foremost in all works of public and private good. In the same spirit, a Meridian, Mississippi newspaper concluded, the men who do the lynchings are not men who flout law, but men who sincerely believe they have the best interests of their fellow men and women at heart. If lynchings were calculated to make an impression on the black community and underscore its vulnerability, whites succeeded. But at the same time, it exposed black men and women in ways they would never forget to the moral character of the white community. The impression conveyed was not so much the racial superiority of whites as their enormous capacity for savagery and cowardice, the way they inflicted their terror as crowds and mobs, rarely as individuals. The lynch mob came, a Mississippi woman remembered. I ain't never heard of no one white man going to get a Negro. They're the most cowardly people I ever heard of. Crossroads. The choices were never easy. The risks were always great. Within rigidly prescribed boundaries, black men and women improvised strategies. Some could no longer contain their feelings and opted for a direct confrontation. Some preferred a quieter subversion of the system. But still others who were rapidly drawing attention at the turn of the century became essentially interior exiles, falling away from society altogether. None of them had access to the more privileged functions and organizations of black society. None of the traditional institutions and outlets offer any comfort, not the family, the school, or the church. Aliens in their own land, empty of belief or hope, volatile, they chose to live by their wits on the fringes of society. Operating in a kind of underworld emerging in the 1890s, mostly in the cities and towns, young blacks tested the limits of permissible dissent and misconduct, sometimes outside the law, and found alternative ways to survive and to circumvent the system, being as much a criminal as they dared to be. Within their enclaves and neighborhoods, in the saloons, roadhouses, juke joints, and pool halls they frequented, they created and sustained a culture of their own, with its distinctive language, rituals, and modes of expression, and its distinctive way of grappling with their condition and prospects. The idea was to avoid a suicidal confrontation, to adopt the necessary deference in the presence of whites and use that deference to allay suspicion. Having learned the futility of hard labor, having experienced or watched others experience the pitfalls of ambition and self-assertion, they might assume an existential attitude toward their lives, value diversions and escape, gambling, drinking, drugs, sexual activity over labor, and improvisation, spontaneity over order and decorum. Since many employers deemed them troublesome and unemployable, they would fulfill those expectations and make a career of natural badness, turning white rejection and stereotypes to their advantage. A nigger is a nigger, they would say. He lives in the basement, no use to run upstairs. Some years later, in the 1930s, a black songster would give voice to precisely this attitude. Because white folks expect nigger to be lazy, ain't no cause to worry. I wouldn't disappoint him for the world. That's why I never hurry. It was in these years, in the Mississippi Delta, where blacks outnumbered whites 3-1, in places such as Ruleville, Drew, Cleveland, Leland, Dockery Farms, Friar Point, Stovall's Plantation, but also in East Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, and the Carolinas, and in urban New Orleans, Helena, Memphis, and St. Louis, that a new musical form appeared. Blues, as it was called, could be heard on street corners and in storefronts, barbershops, train stations, cafes, and brothels, at house frolics, country dances, and Saturday night fish fries, in the boarding houses, the turpentine and lumber work camps, and the crossroads stores, wherever the performers worked, and if they had no work, wherever they could find people ready to part with some of their loose change. The men and women who played and sang the blues were mostly poor, propertyless, disreputable itinerants, many of them illiterate, many of them loners, many of them living on the edge. Rejecting the static lives of their parents, almost always in the move, they felt freer than most and prided themselves on being masterless, on being able to enjoy a freedom of movement and expression denied many of their people, on being free of a labor system that tied others, including their families, to the land through violence, coercion, and the law. Charlie Patton's niece said of her uncle, "He just left when he got ready because he didn't make no crops. He was a free man." Wherever they performed, the bluesmen and blueswomen had an impact. The format and content both bewildered and dismayed some listeners. It was unlike anything anyone had experienced before, and not everyone wanted to listen to it again. Some thought it unearthly, terrifying, threatening, and subversive. Middle-class blacks had expended considerable energy trying to escape primitive stereotypes reinforced by the blues. And many church-going blacks thought the blues to be downright blasphemous, the devil's music. It was an identity they resented and resisted. After purchasing his first guitar with money he had saved from work, W.C. Handy came home overjoyed, only to find his parents furious. "One of the devil's playthings," his father shouted. Take it away, I tell you, get it out of your hands. Whatever possessed you to bring a sinful thing like that into our Christian home? Take it back where it came from." At his father's insistence, a stunned Handy turned in his guitar for a new Webster's Unabridged Dictionary. Even if the instruments could be momentarily denied aspiring musicians, the impulses and feelings that gave birth to the music in the first place overcame every obstacle. It didn't make any difference, Lonnie Johnson recalled, because the feeling was there, and that's all you needed to get started anyway. Raised in Clarksdale, McKinley Morganfield, better known as Muddy Waters, remembered singing from the moment he began chopping cotton as a young boy in the 1920s, and the feelings he was trying to articulate. "I do remember, I was always singing, 'I can't be satisfied, I'd be all trouble in mind.' Seems to me I always been singing that, because I was always singing just the way I felt. Maybe I didn't exactly know it, but I just didn't like the way things were down there in Mississippi." All the conditions of deprivation, repression, and violence helped to shape and sustain the blues. So did the need to confront and transcend those conditions, to recall both good times and bad times, the triumphs along with the defeats. Blues had a language of its own, and to a remarkable degree, it enabled black Southerners to confront betrayed expectations and an accumulation of frustrations, bitterness, and troubles. It could be heard, for example, in the chilling fantasy described by Furry Lewis, born in 1900 and raised in the Delta at Greenwood. "I believe I'll buy me a graveyard of my own. I believe I'll buy me a graveyard of my own. I'm going to kill everybody that have done me wrong." Or in a different kind of fantasy, in which black Southerners turned segregation on its head. "Well, I'm going to buy me a little railroad of my own. Ain't going to let nobody ride with the chocolate to the bone. Well, I'm going to buy me a hotel of my own. Ain't going to let nobody eat but the chocolate to the bone." Or the terrifying imagery and mesmerizing sounds communicated by Robert Johnson when he roamed the Delta. "I got stones in my pathway and my road seems dark as night. I got stones in my pathway and my road seems dark as night. I have pains in my heart. They have taken my appetite." And few could match the emotional depths plumbed by Bertha Chippy Hill in her plaintive, chilling lament, "I'm going to lay my head on a lonesome railroad line and let the 219 pacify my mind." Born in the mid-1890s in the upper Mississippi Delta, bluesman Willie Brown lived and worked mostly on Jim Yeager's plantation, not far from Dockery Farms. He played music with Charlie Patton and Son House and helped to teach and inspire a younger Robert Johnson, who followed Brown from job to job. In one of his songs, Future Blues, Brown used apocalyptic imagery to convey some of the feelings of impermanence that pervaded the black South in the early 20th century. "Can't tell my future, I can't tell my past. Oh Lord, it seems like every minute sure gonna be my last. Oh, minutes seems like hours. Hours seems like days. Yes, minutes seem like hours. Hours seems like days. Whatever the exertions made by black Southerners, no matter how fervently they embraced the work ethic, no matter how bravely they fought as United States soldiers, the future seemed all too bleak and unredeeming, much like the present and the past. Even as black leaders, editors, and preachers thrashed about with their programs, manifestos, and sermons, many black men and women sensed they had been done in. The semi-centennial recitals of race progress, the optimism and confidence expressed by Booker T. Washington, the impressive achievements of a new black middle class, the impressive strides made in education, could not overcome the realities most blacks faced a half-century after emancipation. When common rural black folk, most of them born around the time of emancipation, came to assess their lives, few of their testimonials would have been considered fit reading for the success primers. The rhetoric about racial progress, the impressive statistics, and the rags to riches stories seemed not to touch or reflect their lives. But Langston Hughes suggested some years later, in his bluesy reflection, the lives of the vast majority of black Southerners in the late 19th and early 20th centuries documented all too vividly. Where I come from, folks work hard all their lives until they die and never own no parts of earth or sky. Alias Brown, the High Sheriff of Jefferson County, Alabama, achieved a reputation in the late 19th century for ruthlessness and efficiency. His claim to distinction rested largely on the remarkable white horse he rode, and the stories about that horse's powers reverberated through black Birmingham and in the countryside. The sheriff reportedly never had to shoot at a fleeing black man. He only needed to get down from the horse and let this extraordinary animal pursue him. He would set out after the black fugitive like a hound dog after a rabbit, quickly overtake him, then clasp the fugitive's arm in his teeth and return him to Sheriff Brown. In the early 1890s, at the pipe works at Bessemer, only a few miles from Birmingham, black laborers sang, "Here comes Alias Brown, baby, riding after me, a-riding after me, baby, or riding after me. Here comes Alias Brown, a-riding after me. I'm going back to Birmingham." Some 40 years later, from the Mississippi Delta, as if to suggest how little had changed, bluesman Robert Johnson articulated a lonely and terrifying sense of personal betrayal and anguish that transcended both time and location. With a chilling and relentless matter-of-factness, he suggested a society impossible to change or overcome. He suggested, too, a new generation of interior exiles like himself, exiles in their own land. Even as the black Southerners struggled to achieve some semblance of dignity, to hang on to his self-esteem, the dominant society seemed intent on denying him his very identity, his very humanity. And, like Alias Brown's remarkable white horse, pursued him relentlessly, latched onto him, and refused to let go. I gotta keep moving, I gotta keep moving. Blues falling down like hail, blues falling down like hail, oh, blues falling down like hail, blues falling down like hail. The days keeps on reminding me there's a hellhound on my trail, a hellhound on my trail, a hellhound on my trail. Epilogue. For Richard Wright, as for tens of thousands like him, the move northward exceeded economics or politics. We'd heard all about how the North was freer, Sidney Bechet remembered, and we were wanting to go real bad. It was a place where black men and women could breathe easier and live with less fear, where the tensions, anxieties, and burdens of daily life might be lessened. These are at least the expectations. Some kind of redemption through migration. I headed north, Wright recalled, full of hazy notions that life could be lived with dignity, that the personalities of others should not be violated, that men should be able to confront other men without fear or shame, and that if men were lucky in their living on earth, they might win some redeeming meaning for their having struggled and suffered here beneath the stars. What black migrants found in the North exceeded the expectations of many, even as urban living and working introduced new tensions, new anxieties, new betrayals. In places such as Chicago and New York, Pittsburgh and Detroit, Cleveland and Philadelphia, black migrants came to learn that racial privilege knew no Mason-Dixon line. Nor did racial privilege always manifest itself in lynchings, Jim Crow, disfranchisement, and peonage. It was all very different and was very much the same. It was a different America, and it was a familiar America. Thank you. I'm certainly willing to entertain any questions, comments, reactions. Yes.
I just remembered from my childhood, there was a couple owned a plantation out from this small delta town where we lived. Real nice people, we thought, and were good friends of ours. They were up in years, originally from Louisiana, I think, either French Cajun descent. And they were talking one night. He had operated his plantation out of town, and his wife handled the books for him. And so he was sort of in a jovial mood one night, and he told my parents, says, "Mama makes more with that stubby pencil of hers than I make with the cotton." And which I thought pretty well expressed the type of situation that existed in those days. Maybe still, I don't know.
Yeah. No, that's a good story, and not unlike a number of stories that I found in my own research. In fact, a character who plays an important role in this book, as he should, is Ned Cobb, or as some would know him, Nate Shaw, from Theodore Rosengarten's book. And what in many cases saved Nate Shaw was that he had a wife who was literate and who could do the books and help to at least bring Nate Shaw, at least temporarily, out of a sharecropping situation. The ability to learn the figures, that is what played such a critical role in the quest for education. If anyone had to enumerate the reasons for having one's child acquire an education, it was to learn how to add. It was to learn the figures, learn how to keep accounts. Now, in some cases, once the young person had acquired that knowledge, the parents thought that was enough, and they're ready for that person to quit wherever they might be in school. But that was a driving force, at least, among parents in particular, in trying to encourage their kids to acquire an education. Yeah.
I want to ask you about the other side of the racial equation. Why was it so important for whites to oppress blacks? I still don't understand.
Yes. The question is, why was it so important for whites to oppress blacks? The question that, as you know, as historians, we've been grappling with for many years. We really begin that reflection with Wynne Jordan's book, White Over Black. Where did it all come from? I don't have any ready or easy answer to that very, very important, very troubling question. In this period, it seemed absolutely imperative for most whites to maintain the subordination of blacks by any means, as they often said, by any means necessary. That meant, in many cases, not even permitting blacks to assert some semblance of independence, some semblance of autonomy. The psychology that dictated that kind of approach, that's a difficult question to answer. I mean, one could say it's all based on greed, on economic motives, on class, but I think it goes beyond that, far beyond that. That's not a sufficient explanation. And a question I have not been able to resolve in my own mind. Yes.
In your readings, you detailed a few examples that come out of the Mississippi Delta, which we all know is probably the most graphic illustration of the differences between white and black and racism. And my question to you is how do you evaluate the introduction of Northern capital and, to an extent, British capital into the Mississippi Delta in the 1890s, in the turn of the century, to increase the social conditions that existed there in terms of like the Illinois Central Railroad and various spinning companies over in the UK that invested heavily in there and wanted to see cotton production rise to all-time new levels. Outside of the South, how do other factors play into the hands of making the Delta so difficult?
Well, economics certainly plays a leading role in the settlement of the Delta. I mean, the Delta is not settled until, as you know, until later in the 1880s, 1890s. Now, at the outset, at least, the Delta seemed to be, if you're looking at migration patterns, there's a considerable movement of blacks into the Delta in the 1880s, 1890s in particular. And the reason for that movement to the Delta is because of the promise, in their own minds at least, the promise of improving their economic position. Because they saw this as a developing area. They saw developing plantations and thought that they would be able to acquire some degree of economic independence by moving into the Delta. And particularly when they were coming from areas in the Old South that where the soil was no longer as fertile. So that's the irony, that the Delta at first is considered to be a place of considerable promise. I think Dockery Farms, for example, was established around 1895, one of many plantations established around that time. But what they had hoped to find, the realities turned out to be something quite different. And before they knew it, they had found themselves in an economic system that, like in places where they'd come from, offered very little opportunity for acquiring the independence they wanted, in part because, of course, they couldn't afford purchasing large parcels of land, and it was all being bought up around them. So what had been at first a very promising development for blacks turned out to be something quite different. Any other question? Yes?
You spoke of lynching as a ritual, and I wondered what larger social or cultural function such a ritual might have served.
The question is about the lynching as a ritual and what purpose it seemed to serve. In a certain sense, it brought white people together at a kind of collective experience, and white people, I think, of all classes, what induced them to board these excursion trains that would often bring them to these executions. Men, women, and children. In some cases, schools were let out so that children could attend to the executions. I find it. I mean, I was prepared for a great deal when I began to look at lynchings. Prepared to see a great deal in terms of the atrocities. I don't think I was quite prepared for the ritualistic quality that would take on. I suddenly found myself with a stack. This is not really directly answer your question. I suddenly found myself with a stack of materials on lynchings, and at the very end was able to use maybe a tenth of those materials, because at a certain point you almost numb the senses of your reader, I think. I tried to suggest a variety of lynchings. I tried to look at what sometimes whites call a good lynching as opposed to a bad lynching. A good lynching is when it's done fairly expeditiously, with less of the dismemberment. That could be called a good lynching by the press. And when it's a bad lynching, it's because the lynchers have somehow gotten out of control. They've gone too far. So the press will even distinguish between these kinds of lynchings. I mean, I just gave you one example of what, of many different examples. The extent to which lynching is turned into The photographs are taken on lynchings. Not only photographs that are taken lynchings on the spot, but then sold on the spot. And there are postcards, many postcards, which featured lynchings, that is looking at the body of the lynched person. So something is going on here. And lynchings had existed before. They were not a new phenomenon. Lynchings had been applied to whites and blacks. It's by the 1890s that lynchings become racial, in the sense that mostly blacks are victims, and most of the lynchings are now taking place in the South. And at the same time, it begins to take on that ritualistic quality, that bringing the community together. And the community also stands together, for the most part, in impeding any attempt to investigate the lynching. In most cases, the names of the lynchers are very well known because they are very often prominent people in the community, or people who are known in the community. But when a jury is impaneled to look at a lynching, almost always the local or state officials will simply say the lynching was committed by unknown people who are not known to the authorities. Well, of course, that was not true. And to any politician, it was suicidal to resist the lynchings. One could be critical of them, but you had to be critical within a certain context. And it became costly to anyone with political aspirations to condemn the lynchers indiscriminately. And lynchings take place in some of the most churchified communities in the South. And the churches themselves are pretty much paralyzed by what's happening. I have one minister who simply said, I can't say anything about it because some of the people who are in that mob are my best parishioners. There's nothing I can do about it. And of course that gets you then into the whole judicial system, how that judicial system operates. And it was very difficult to resist. I mean, I do have some accounts of one in particular, a white sheriff in South Carolina. And he's determined that a black person has been arrested as a suspect, and the sheriff, a very conscientious man, is determined that this person's going to get a trial. He hears the mob forming outside. And he's going to stand up there and simply say, you're not going to have this person is going to go to trial. Well, he opens the door to make his statement, and he looks at the mob, and what shocks him is right in the front row, the most prominent people in town. And once he sees who is there and where they are standing, he knows there's nothing he can do. And they simply come into the jail, take the man out, and do their business. Doesn't fully answer your question as to why it takes on this ritualistic quality, but it seems to have become a kind of collective celebration, if you want to call it that, of white supremacy. And I think also lynchings are seen as a warning to the black community. So in some cases, after someone has been lynched, they will take the body and take it through, cart it, and put it in a cart and take it right into the black community, and take it through the black community. Some of the people who I've quoted in the book, some black men, women, actually children, say their first knowledge of any kind of lynching was when that happened, when the body was brought into their own community as a warning. Yes.
Do you mention Bull Connor in your book at all?
No. The book, although, I mean, the seeds, of course, are of what I'm describing here in the age of Jim Crow. The seeds are planted in the forcible overthrow Reconstruction. And of course, Jim Crow itself spans goes right up into the very eve of the Civil Rights Movement. I've chosen for the purposes of this book to concentrate on what is probably the most violent and virulent period in history of race relations in the South, and that's from the 1890 to World War I. But I've already begun work on the sequel, And the sequel will look at the Black South in the 1920s, 1930s, with a particular focus on what happens to race relations in the South during World War II. And that one will come up to the eve of the Civil Rights Movement, and I'll let Taylor Branch take it from there. Yes?
Going a little bit into that, what would you say were the chief reasons, maybe agents of change that began to weaken or alleviate the white supremacy?
The question is about what agents of change ultimately doom Jim Crow. Okay. Again, that's a complicated question. Some see World War II as a turning point, and I think it may have been a turning point, certainly in terms of some of the seeds that are laid during World War II, not that things are going to really change during World War II. But the economic gains made by blacks during World War II, the emergence of another generation that is intent on not repeating the errors of its parents. And of course things began to change because, I mean, the change that take place within the context of the end of World War II, the war that was fought against fascism and for democracy, in the context of a Cold War in which civil rights is no longer a domestic issue. Civil rights becomes an international issue. Civil rights becomes a matter of national security. Civil rights is something that begins to attract the attention not only of the Justice Department but of the State Department. I think many of the changes that take place in civil rights and after World War II, right into the early 50s, take place because the United States can no longer afford that kind of a racial record when it's seeking allies abroad, when it's facing relentless communist propaganda about race relations in this country. And there's a need to respond. So when President Eisenhower decides to send troops to Little Rock, now he's not sitting there because he believes in the integration schools. He does not. You know, Eisenhower once said the biggest damn fool mistake he ever made was to appoint Earl Warren as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He doesn't try to justify it along those lines. But he justifies it because, one, he's a good soldier, he must obey the law. And secondly, he makes it very clear in his address to the American people because of what the communists are doing with this particular episode. When President Kennedy tries to, and his Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, when they try to justify their actions in the area of civil rights, albeit belated actions in the area of civil rights, the Kennedys too resort to that particular rationalization for their conduct. So you don't find them necessarily saying, as they should have been saying, of course, that we have to grant civil rights to black people because it's right. But instead they are able to find, well, whatever the reasons, at least, something happened. And of course, at the same time, and that's another story in itself, there's a new generation of black Southerners, of young black Southerners in particular, that are simply not willing to stand by and see the country go back to what it had been before. But even in the period that I'm looking at, up to the 1920s, there's a good deal of evidence, and it's in the book as well, there's a great deal of generational conflict going on between father and son, father and daughter, mother and son, mother and daughter, of younger people who are just simply not willing to resign themselves to accommodate in the same way that their parents did, and who make a break along those lines. Yes?
Between 1890 and the First World War, how much you spoke of how violent and how treacherous race relations were during the time period. How much do you see the generational change, the first generation of both whites and blacks since the war coming of age, not knowing the old social etiquette, the old ways, and then also the agrarian discontent in the South, which threatened to divide the whites, and maybe as a reason that they needed a ritual, the whites needed a ritual lynching to bring them all together. How much do you see those two factors playing in?
The white South perceives what it calls, and what blacks themselves call, a new Negro. It perceives black people coming of age, born after emancipation, who have not known the discipline of slavery, who have not learned the proper etiquette, well, their parents do try to teach it, but who don't practice that etiquette. And this is a generation that is being carefully monitored by whites, and they don't like what they see, they don't like what they hear. I think it has a lot to do with what happens in the South between 1890 and 1920. I mean, after all, segregation had existed before, not in as rigid a form, but the fact of the matter is that segregation as custom was not working as it had worked before. And I think in large part, disfranchisement, Jim Crow, and much of the violence that we see in this period is a direct response to perceptions of a new generation of blacks that will not stay in its place without legal and extra-legal compulsions of this kind. So I think that becomes a very critical factor. Yes, and there's a new generation of whites as well, a generation that has not been brought up with the kind of noblesse oblige that some had claimed, a generation, some of whom even feel that they missed something by not having been a part of the Civil War, who do not feel the same kind of relationship perhaps to blacks that their parents may have felt, and that too exacerbates the situation. There are some attempts in this period, and probably the populist movement is maybe the one you had in mind, where black farmers, I mean, we have sort of a situation that seems rather obvious. White farmers and black farmers are in many instances suffering from the same problems, the same grievances, the same kind of exploitation. So why not lay aside those racial antagonisms and combine along lines of class? That was, some would say, the populist promise, but it never worked. It never really came to pass. Although there's some instances, isolated instances, where one could see some success in terms of blacks and whites uniting politically, where it was to the political advantage of both to unite their forces, as in certain counties in North Carolina, certain sections of Texas, briefly in certain areas of Georgia. But for the most part, this is true of the labor movement as well. For the most part, class consciousness can simply not overcome race consciousness, and in the end, race consciousness really destroys those experiments or those efforts. Yes?
Yes, I have two questions. My first one is, were these community-based lynchings, these spectacle lynchings, were they the majority of lynchings or the minority? And my second question is that, does your research reveal any religious justifications given by whites for these lynchings? You said that they occurred in real heavily religious-based communities, and I was wondering if you found any religious justifications given.
They didn't occur particularly in churchified communities, but they certainly occurred in many of them. Yeah. I haven't done a quantitative study that would enable me to say that that the vast majority of lynchings were of the most brutal type, or let me put it this way, that the vast majority of lynchings were good lynchings as opposed to the bad lynchings. There was certainly a large number of both. And what happens after some time is that lynchings also become so regular that they're not reported in as much detail. But for the most part, newspapers don't spare any details. I mean, they'll tell you everything that happened. But after a while, you begin to look at the paper and you'll see, instead of a major article on the front page, you'll see something on the third page or so, and just a little item indicating that some black man was lynched in such and such place. And this is where it's a local matter as well. But I can't answer that definitively in terms of whether it would be true of the majority of lynchings. I'm sorry, your second question was about...
you mentioned that these occurred often in
the
towns
church,
that had
whether the...
religious base.
Yes. One of the justifications for a lynching is that some violence has been practiced on white women. And when that is the provocation, then often a church leader will indicate that this violence, while regrettable, is understandable because of the nature of the crime. However, it should be noted that even the allegation of rape was the reason for a lynching in a minority of cases. Most lynchings are not provoked by alleged violence against white women. Most of the lynchings were prompted by altercations involving work, involving settlements, involving violence on owners or employers or whites for other reasons than sexual reasons. Many of the lynchings occurred simply because a community felt that it was time to have a lynching. That it was a way of keeping black people in their place, a constant reminder that black people had to heed. So in so many cases you can find no particular reason for a lynching other than perhaps recreational starvation. And what lynchings do not, what these statistics do not reveal are the large number of cases in which there is no lynching, but the blacks who are fished out of creeks and rivers, who in many cases have been killed in what a Floridian called a nigger hunt, where it's again a part of a recreational pursuit. I don't know if we have any really account of those particular, those are murders rather than outright lynchings. Yes.
Coming up a little further toward modern times, the relation of the church to race was still pretty strong. During the 60s, for instance, when blacks were trying to integrate the white churches in Mississippi, the members of the church board were standing at the door, physically blocking their entrance into the church. And when a group of Methodist ministers in Mississippi made a declaration, and I've never read it, so I'm not sure of the exact contents, but it had something to do with supporting the ruling of the Supreme Court on school integration and observing the law and things that a proper church member should support. Most of those ministers were thrown out of their churches, and many of them left the state completely. Maxie Dunham from Gulfport was one. He went to California, and he's back in the South, and now he's president of a theological seminary, I believe. But there was definite church action of a nature that they explained quite. Oh, you know, they quoted scripture like mad, justifying their action and lots of things, you know. But it was still troubling to someone who takes his religion seriously. It's a little hard to understand, and you wonder if some of that still occurs.
Well, the first time I came across ministers who stood in the door because they did not want black parishioners was not in the South but in the North, before the Civil War, when many churches in the North insisted on remaining all white. Yes, you have a question.
Someone mentioned earlier that some of the most graphic examples of Jim Crow seem to come out of the Delta, and I was wondering if you found any kind of difference, social, psychological, physical, in the practice of Jim Crow in different parts of the South, the Upper South, the Atlantic South, the border states. Is there any difference? Is it true that the Delta seems to be the most inflammatory?
I don't know that it is, and I was aware of the fact that trying to deal with the entire South. I might have used more examples from Mississippi because of the fact that I'm in Mississippi, but I certainly have many examples from all over the South, particularly in places like Tennessee, Alabama. Of course, Georgia, I think, led the country, and for some years, Georgia led the country in the number of lynchings. Florida. No, South Carolina. I mean, it's North Carolina. There are examples everywhere. And I didn't find any concentration of this kind of violence in Mississippi as opposed to other parts of the South.
Northeast Mississippi has had a reputation for quite a while in that regard, and is used as an explanation for the fact that there are very few blacks in that area, even today.
How long did W.C. Handy got his guitar?
Oh, W.C. Handy. He got it pretty quickly. I think what happened in some cases, same thing happened with Charlie Patton. Charlie Patton's father resisted his attempt to, thought it was just, thought he was wasting his time playing guitar when he should have been out there, should be out there working and helping, and was beaten sometime because he wanted to play guitar, preferred to play guitar. But after a while, his father just gave up and also recognized that his son had talent. And instead of opposing it, began to encourage him, as did his mother. So that was the Charlie Patton's case. Robert Johnson also encountered opposition from, it's something that's repeated quite often. Many of these young aspiring blues musicians, in fact, got their guitars. They saved up some money to get their guitars in Sears Roebuck catalog. And some of them, some of the guitars, as I've indicated, were just destroyed by outraged parents. But Handy recovered soon enough. Yes.
How different were the experiences between black men and black women during the age of Jim Crow?
Sorry, how different?
How different the gender convention, the experiences during the Jim Crow era.
The experiences of black men and black
men versus black men, black women. The differences between black men and black women.
Yes. The differences between black men and black women in terms of white attitudes, in terms of white actions.
Well, just the whole play of life during the era.
Black women face the same obstacles, the same kind of violence as did black men. Black women are lynched. Families are lynched together, in which the lynch mob first go the children, and then the mother, and then the father has to see his entire family lynched before he too is lynched. But black women encounter at the same time the vulnerability to white men. Most of the attention, of course, has been paid to alleged violence, sexual violence against white women, but very little is ever said about white sexual violence against black women, which was constant in this period. But very little protest among whites because black women were considered to be naturally licentious. So in a number of instances, a judge, for example, will refuse to convict a white man of raping a black woman because he will argue that you can't rape a white woman, that a white woman is already, as I said, naturally licentious. And black women face, of course, problems within the black family. Many of them have to bear a particular burden within the family. It's quite clear that in many instances, the effects of Jim Crow, the effects of the humiliations suffered in Jim Crow, the effects of the economic position that the blacks occupy will create tensions, anxieties, and violence within the black family as well. I think Zora Neale Hurston rather summed up better than probably anyone the plight of black women, as I think it's a grandmother who gives some advice to her daughter in their eyes are watching God, and that probably summed it up as better than anyone else could. Charles.
How did African Americans attempt to cope with the terrible experiences that they had? You mentioned the blues as a form of culture that articulated feelings living through this kind of oppression, but what other forms of culture or experience did serve some kind of function to survival mechanisms?
Well, what happens in this period, beginning in the 1890s, is that black people begin to withdraw into their own communities, establishing kind of replica of the white community with their own institutions, their own organizations, fraternal orders, and of course, most importantly, the church. And the church, for many, becomes a critical refuge in this period. Not only the religion of the church, but also the church as a kind of community center, as a social center. I think what one finds in this period is not simply, the kind of oppression that I described, but also the extraordinary amount of resourcefulness by black people to endure. I mean, one of the chapters I didn't read from today is actually called Enduring. And it's in that chapter that I deal with the black church, for example. Also the emergence in this period of the holiness movement, which is important. There's a fascinating story within the history of the church in this period as well, because many black Southerners in relying on the church also want the kind of religion that will enable them, the kind of services that will really enable them to escape in some way the day-to-day world that they face. And that is often not supplied by the so-called educated clergy. So throughout this period, this conflict between the educated clergy and the untrained clergy. But what some blacks really want is the untrained clergy, because it gives them more of a feeling, at least, of being a part of something, and it also enables. It's also important because the holiness church permits them to participate to a much larger extent. So that becomes important. We see in this period also an emerging, and I didn't deal with it in this talk, we see an emerging black middle class. Businessmen, professionals, and this is an important development. And out of that, you'll also see the formation of fraternal orders, benevolent societies that are, for the most part, a part of that middle class world. But I also have to make the point that for the vast majority of black Southerners in this period, that's another world. Not so much the church, but the fraternal orders, the middle class organizations that are established. There's a recent book, well, I won't get into that. I mean, there's a lot of resourcefulness, and I try to deal with that as much as possible. This is not simply to my mind at least, this is not simply a book about victimizers and victims. But at the same time, I think we have to recognize the period that we're dealing with. And I believe we have to confront the kind of victimization that does go on. It's fashionable now among historians sometimes to say in a book, too much victimization, not enough agency. Well, I don't like either term particularly. I think this book does tell you about the resourcefulness of black people, while at the same time not minimizing the conditions that and the pressures they have to confront. Yes?
In my U.S. history survey class at Mississippi Valley, I try to strongly emphasize African American history, and the brutality of Jim Crow. But a point, it never really came clear to my students till they started reading Coming of Age in Mississippi. It's a later period, but they were stunned by the fear that their grandparents presumably experienced. And one student said, imagine what it must have been like during the more brutal period of Jim Crow, and it really kind of just quieted the room down for a second.
No, I found that to be true when I, not only my own students back in Berkeley, but when I came here as a visitor in 1989 and taught the course on history of African Americans and race relations here at Ole Miss from 1865 to the present. And I remember, particularly after this lecture on lynchings and Jim Crow, two young women came up to me. They were from Brookhaven, Massachusetts, Brookhaven, Mississippi. And they said, President Levi, but we found it very hard to believe all what you said about the lynchings. That we thought it was just so brutal. And I said, yes, it was. And they then said, but weren't you kidding? Weren't you just kidding us about the separate drinking fountains? Isn't that just a joke? And then I became curious. And I said, well, where are you from? Now, everyone in this class, with one exception, was from Mississippi. The one exception was someone from Tennessee. But I asked them, where are you from? They said, Brookhaven. I said, well, I know Brookhaven. Did you go to the public schools in Brookhaven? They said, oh, yes. And oh, yes. And they said, we know that was segregated at one time. And they also revealed that some 60%, I think, of that school was black. The school that they graduated from, public school. I said, did you learn nothing about what I just talked about? I said, no, not at all. So I said, well, I guess to myself, I guess it's good that I'm here. Now, a couple of weeks later, the two young women came back to see me, and they said, oh, Professor Litwack, we were home over the weekend, and we told our parents about what we were learning in your class. Well, I could anticipate it already. Oh my God, not only are they hearing it from a Yankee, but a Berkeley carpetbagger. No, that's not what they said at all. They said, we told our parents what we were learning in this course, and their parents said, yes, that all happened, and it's about time we learned it. I found that very revealing. It's as though, I don't know how true it would have been of others of that age, but it's as though a whole generation hadn't really been told very much by their parents about what conditions had been like before the civil rights era. I found that a rather interesting incident in my life at Ole Miss that semester.
I think we could probably keep you for the rest of the night, but maybe we ought to give you a round of applause and say thank you.
Thank you. Or more often than not, poor and declining prices and the rigid controls exerted by white men over black income. The only certainty was that by the time the landlord had taken his share and deducted the cost for the fertilizer and the money or credit advances he had made, there wasn't but just enough to carry on till the next crop. But Charlie persisted, and one year he seemed primed to break out of the cycle of indebtedness. After selling his tobacco and settling with the landlord, he had something for himself, or so he thought. That was when the man called him back and told him he had underestimated the amount Charlie owed him for warehouse charges. The tactic was all too familiar, and Charlie's inability to read the books made any legal protest impossible. I knowed it wasn't right, and it made me so mad I just hit him in the face as hard as I could. The judge sentenced Charlie to a year's labor on the roads, a lenient sentence for an interracial altercation. His wife and children did what they could to make a crop, but it was not enough to meet expenses. The landlord agreed to carry them over, and it took Charlie 3 years to pay him back. By that time, I knowed it wasn't no use for me to try to ever make anything but just a living. Although Charlie Holcomb made his accommodation, he wanted something better for his oldest son, Willie. I was determined my oldest child was going to have a chance in this world, and I sent him all the way through high school. That was more education than any Holcomb had known. But after completing high school, Willie wanted to go to college, arguing that it would enable him to improve his economic prospects significantly. At considerable sacrifice, the Holcombs sent their child to the Agricultural and Technical College of North Carolina in Greensboro. Willie worked hard, made good grades, and in the summer returned to help his parents with the crop. I'm here or come to Berkeley, where I'm doing a reading on April the 9th, I said without hesitation, Oxford. And it's a pleasure to be here and to share some of this work with you, and to try to keep my remarks or reading as brief as possible. And I thought I would start with the initial story in the book, because that story really does set the mood for this work. Even though it's a bit long, I would still like to share that one with you at the very outset. I'm going to go in a kind of progression as the book moves along, and so this is part one, baptisms. The pine board shack in which Charlie Holcomb spent his childhood in the late 19th century rested on top of a red clay hill about a quarter of a mile from the main road in Sampson County, North Carolina. His father, a tenant tobacco farmer, rose each morning at 4 o'clock, laid the logs for a fire, and roused the children, while Charlie's mother prepared a breakfast consisting of a pot of grits and a slab of salt pork. It was important to be in the field at sunup during the growing season, as the soil was poor and the labor that much more demanding. They worked till sundown. Grandfather Holcomb did not work in the field. He had the miseries in his back and walked with a stick. But he performed other chores, slopping the hogs and feeding the chickens. Charlie Holcomb, considered too young and frail to work in the fields, helped his grandfather with the chores and often accompanied him to the nearby creek to catch a mess of catfish for supper. As they sat there waiting for the fish to bite, Grandfather would do a heap of thinking. And some
new course that began in 1968 at Berkeley on the history of Afro-Americans and race relations. And for a number of years, I taught the first half of the U.S. History Survey. He taught the second half, and he is still doing so. And doing so very well indeed. We're here to celebrate and hear him talk about his new book, which is Trouble in Mind, Black Southerners in the Age of Jim Crow. I've talked with him enough over the years of its development that I have enormously high expectations of it. I'm going to clear out quickly, Leon, but I do want to end with a quotation from Flannery O'Connor, which I thought you particularly would appreciate. This is what O'Connor had to say. Everywhere I go, I'm asked if I think the university stifles writers. My opinion is that they don't stifle them enough. There's many a bestseller that could have been prevented by a good teacher. Leon Litwack.
Thank you very much, Win. It's a pleasure to be back in Oxford. This is the official publication date of the book, and I couldn't think of a better place to be. And indeed, when C-SPAN said they would either come, times he shared his thoughts with Charlie, his youngest grandson, often imparting practical lessons drawn from his own life on how a black boy might hope to survive in the South less than half a century after emancipation. Charlie remembered one lesson in particular. After catching a large catfish, Grandfather Holcomb toyed with it for a time, admonishing his grandson to watch him. He carefully lifted the fish out of the creek, let it thrash about, then lowered the line and returned the fish to the water. It would swim again, but not for long. Grandfather suddenly pulled it out on the bank, where it thrashed about until it died. Son, his grandfather observed, a catfish is a lot like a nigger. As long as he's in his mud hole, he's all right. But when he gets out, he's in for a passel of trouble. You remember that. You won't have no trouble with folks when you grows up. Neither Charlie's father nor his grandfather had owned the land they worked. But as a young man, Charlie Holcomb aspired to improve himself and be independent of whites, and he possessed an abundance of confidence about his ability to succeed. He vowed to break with a bleak past of arduous and mostly unrewarded labor. I thought I could manage my business better and that I was going to be able to own a place of my own someday. I was a high-minded young nigger and was full of get up and get. There was nothing in the world that I didn't think I could do. After his parents died, Charlie moved to Johnson County, North Carolina, took a job in the public works, saved some money, and married. In 1909, he settled down on a farm, determined to make it his own. But like so many aspiring young blacks, the children and the grandchildren of slaves, he confronted formidable obstacles in his struggle to be independent. There was always something come along and knocked the props from under my plans. That something might be the worms, rust, or blight consuming the tobacco plant.
This is a great pleasure. I've had practice at doing this, actually, particularly with Leon, since we go way back together. He is currently the Morrison Professor of History at University of California at Berkeley, and we were colleagues there for many years together. His first book was North of Slavery, The Negro in the Free States, 1790 through 1860, published, I believe, back in 1961. And then a book that made an enormous splash, published in 1979, was a book that many of you probably know about, Been in the Storm So Long, The Aftermath of Slavery, which won the Francis Parkman Prize with its emphasis on style, the American Book Award, and the Pulitzer Prize. Leon has also done films and slides. He's won several teaching awards. He's been president of the Organization of American Historians, and we've both just come back from their annual meeting, which this year was in Indianapolis. His versatility and talents are just enormous. He and I both taught. I taught the first half, he taught the second half of an